Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or wherever you're joining us from. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second UNU-INWEH Science Talk of 2025. My name is Dr. Miriam Axel, and I'm thrilled to be your host today. For those of you new to Science Talks, our weekly series showcases the exciting research of UNU-INWEH and our collaborators, highlighting real-world applications that address pressing global challenges. But these talks are not just academic exercises, they're an invitation to engage with science that drives positive change. I'm pleased to share that all of our previous science talks are available on demand on our website and on our YouTube channel. You can watch the entire 2024 series hosted by the illustrious Professor Grace Oluwasanya on our website and our YouTube channel. Our website is unu.edu/INWEH/science-talks. Today's talk, like all others, will be recorded, and both the video and the slides will be made available after the session. We'll conclude with an interactive question and answer session where I'll be moderating your questions. Please type your questions directly into the Q&A box, and I will share them with our speaker. It's my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Marc Muller. Dr. Muller is Associate Research Professor at United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health, where he focuses on advancing evidence-based empirical research to support multilateral environmental agreements. His work aims to provide scientific insights that enhance global efforts in environmental diplomacy and sustainable resource management. He also leads a research group on coupled human water systems at the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology near Zurich. With an educational background from EFPL, UC Berkeley, Stanford University, he previously served as associate professor at University of Notre Dame in the United States, where he maintains an affiliation. His research on the dynamics of human-water interactions in regions that are both data scarce and rapidly changing was recognized by fellowships from multiple institutions, such as the U.S. Department of State through Fulbright program and the Swiss and U.S. National Science Foundations. Dr. Muller actively seeks to bridge the divide between research and policy, recently contributing to high-level dialogues at venues including the United Nations and the Swiss Embassy in Washington, D.C. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Marc Muller to the Science Talk stage. Marc, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's great to be part of the INWEH family, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about this research. So this is very much teamwork. So it's not just my own work. It's been an ongoing project for the last, 7 years that involves people from many different institutions all over the world, particularly in the US and Europe. You could see them here. And so we've been focusing on this notion of transnational land acquisition and the effect it might have on the food, water, energy, and environment nexus. All right, so there has been a global land rush for the last, 25 years or so. Approximately 30 million hectares of land have been acquired by foreign investors. So these are either sovereign funds from foreign nations or multinationals that are based in foreign nations that have acquired land in countries over the last 25 years. So it's approximately the area of Italy, and this is an underestimation. Some underestimates place this area to about the size of Western Europe. So it's a huge amount of land. There's many reasons for this phenomenon. You could think about the food price crisis in the early 2000s. There's also been a push to commodify land, so making land private property that could be sold. Also the rise of biofuel, and we have also ongoing events that make us think that this practice has bright days in front of it. So it's not over quite yet. You could think about the food supply chain disruptions like happened with the conflict in Ukraine, for example, or the ongoing rush for clean energy minerals that has led to an increase in transnational land investments. Now, as with many dynamics, there's really two sides to the phenomenon, if you think about it. So some proponents have said that maybe it's actually not a bad thing if we want to close a yield gap. So we have 10 billion people to feed pretty soon, and agriculture in many places of the global south is notoriously underinvested in. So maybe it's a good thing that so much capital pours into the agriculture, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And also there has been some positive spillovers that have been documented in terms of creating income generation activities or even a spillover of agricultural technologies and things like that that happen in the vicinity of these land deals. But now, of course, there's a flip side to the medal, and many opponents to the practice have suggested that this leads to resource overuse, environmental degradation, and perhaps more importantly, the displacement of local farmers, suppression of livelihood, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are several case studies that have provided evidence at the local level for both aspects. And what we really tried to do was to take a step back and use global data to try to understand where the ball drops, at the global scale. If we use all the data that's available to us at the global scale to understand what the consequences are of this practice, what could we actually say? So we took this very important and very nice data set of land yields. It's called the Land Matrix data set, assembled by the University of Bern. In total, it's about 2,000 land yields. Approximately 400 of them have actual coordinates, so we can actually put them on a map. And so these are the ones that we considered. And then we overlaid these land deals location with several key variables that relate to the food, water, energy, and environmental nexus, including crop cover, crop water use, etc. You see the list on the table here. And we try to systematically analyze, how these variables have changed in the land deals, next to the land deals, in order to see what we could tell about their effects. So I won't spend too much time on this, but we try to be as rigorous as possible in terms of using causal inference approaches that have been developed in several fields, including development economics, for example. Whenever we could, we did regression discontinuity when we had annual or higher frequency variables. If that was not possible, we tried to implement some type of difference in difference analysis, identifying valid counterfactual control reasons. And when neither was available, then we use model simulations. So in terms of the counterfactual, this is really critical when you try to evaluate causal impact. So first of all, in many of the land deals, we don't actually have access to the full polygon of the actual land that's been purchased. We know the centroid and we know the area of the land. And so we estimated the land purchase by a disk with the same area and the same centroid. And then in order to identify a control, so this is land that's comparable to the purchased land, but that has not been purchased. And so that provides, a control to compare to what happens within the land deal. We use this type of donut strategy where we removed a certain area, so double the radius of the original disk, and then beyond this, we included in additional time the radius of the disk as a control, as you could see on the illustration here. And then we did a whole bunch of robustness check, making sure that there's no spillover, meaning that whatever happens in the control region does not have a direct effect on whatever happens in the treatment region does not have a direct effect on the control region. And we also did some tests to make sure that the two areas, namely the control and the treatment, are actually comparable. I won't get into details about how that works, but I'm happy to send you the papers. So in terms of the results, so these are papers that have been published already. You can see the references here. We did one paper on the environment where we were interested in forest cover. So we know that land deals affect forest cover. That's already been known for a very long time, and it kind of makes sense, right? The investors take the forest away and then develop the land, so to say. But what this study has been able to uncover are specific mechanisms that I think are interesting because they vary across regions. So what you see on the screen here is a regression discontinuity plot where you have on the x-axis time normalized when the deal was being concluded, right? So year 0 is when the deal is concluded, positive is after the deal, negative is before the deal. And then on the y-axis, you have the percentage of the deal or the control areas that are covered by forest. And then the different colors represents the average across different regions. So here, Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe. And we could see immediately that there's very different patterns that come up. So in Asia, clearly there is a kink at zero, which is kind of a telltale of a causal effect, right? So you have no kink at the control, so no change in deforestation in the control region, and a change in deforestation in the treatment region that happened when the deal happened. So very likely the deal caused deforestation in Asia. In Eastern Europe, you could see that there is no real deforestation. There's no slope here. The forest cover remains constant, both within the deal and beyond the deal. And it's also very low, right? So these are regions that are already deforested. So the deal did not cause deforestation because there wasn't any forest to speak of. In Africa, it's quite interesting because you could see a different behavior in the deal region, which you could see in solid in the control region in dashed. But that happens already before the land deal. So you could see an increase in the deforestation rate in the area that will end up being purchased that happened already before the area was actually purchased. So this could happen either, for example, because the land was being prepared to increase its attractiveness to investors, or because deforestation and land investment have similar covariates. For example, if the land deal is closer to a city, perhaps it's more valuable to investors, and perhaps it's also easier to deforest. So these are quite interesting because they really kind of showcase different mechanisms that take place into how land deals are being deforested. The next thing that we looked at is biodiversity. So here we used a global model that linked land system. So based on empirical data, it linked land system and what's known as the relative species richness. So it's the ratio between the number of vertebrate species that are right now on the land and the number of vertebrate species that would have been on the land if it would not have been developed, so in a pristine region. And we use this model to simulate or to estimate, so it's our best estimate of the relative species richness in the purchased land before the deal was being concluded. And you can see that in general, it's pretty high. So 100% means that it's completely pristine. You have the highest biodiversity that the ecosystem could support. And the colors here indicate the region of the world. So if I remember correctly, green is Asia, and purple here is Sub-Saharan Africa, and green here, so not teal, the other green is Eastern Europe. And then we did the same computation, but after the land deals, and computed the change in relative species richness. And you could see a significant drop expected if the deal was fully developed. So given the intention of the landowners, so the data set I forgot to mention, but the land matrix data set contains information on the type of crop that the purchaser is intending to plant, if it's for cotton, for example, and stuff like that. So we were able to have the best guess of the type of development that was going to happen. And you could see that particularly for intended tree plantations, so these are palm oil or cocoa farm or rubber farms, stuff like that, you have a particularly large decrease in biodiversity. Moving on to the next sector, we also looked at agriculture. So we know that land deals, particularly when the intention is to produce food, they cause an increase in cropland. I mean, this kind of, it's pretty intuitive. But what's important is that in addition to increased cropland, you also have a switch in the type of crop that's being planted. And so we were able to characterize the switch, and clearly you have a switch from local crops, so like manioc in Africa, for example, towards crops that are easier to export. And to kind of put a number on this phenomenon, we evaluated the propensity of export of the crop being planted. So this is using FAO trade data. We determined, the probability of any given crop planted on the land deal of being exported. And we could see that that this probability increased by quite a bit, particularly in Asia, where you usually move from rice or very local crops towards palm oil, for example, and also to a lesser extent in Africa. In Eastern Europe and Latin America, it's quite interesting because these are already very agriculturally intensive regions that have been purchased. And so you have a very high probability of exports to begin with. So you didn't have much change after the land was acquired. The next sector that we looked at is water. So here it's generally interesting because you could really generally make two sides of the argument. You could both improve or worsen the water situation. So for example, if you're in condition of economic water scarcity, so this is this situation right here, where you need irrigation, you have enough irrigation water for it to happen, but what you don't have is infrastructure to access the water. So under this condition, then having investments into land deals and presumably irrigation infrastructure could be a good thing, right? In other circumstances, it's neutral. If you need irrigation, there's already infrastructure to access it, but there's enough water for everybody, then we said it didn't make a difference if you have an additional use of the water, if there's enough water anyway. However, if you need irrigation, but there's not enough water for it to happen, then adding an additional draw on the resource will create water competition and potentially expand water scarcity. And these are the bad situations. So what we try to do is use a global hydrological model coupled with a crop model to put all these deals, the 400 or so deals that we looked at, into these buckets to identify with the percentage of them where that were positive in terms of the impact on the water sector potentially. So we found that this situation where you are under economic water scarcity, so positive impact of the land deal, is actually a very small minority of all the land deals. In many cases, in most of the purchased land, you have already pre-existing water scarcity, so increasing reliance on water resources, particularly because the added crop is usually much more water thirsty than the native crop that was planted there before, is very, very detrimental. And so we simulated actually the amount. So if the land was fully developed, how much of it would be under strong, physical water scarcity, so under water competition. And you could see here that the large majority of the lands that is in blue right here would be under strong water competition. What's important with water is that it flows downstream. And so if you use too much water at a particular point, it could be that you affect how much water is available further down in the basin. And so we simulated this effect, and we took several deals. So for example, those two in Ethiopia, we simulated then the water use associated with the full development of the land deal and evaluated how far the ensuing water scarcity could be felt. And so you could see that for those two land deals, it could be hundreds of kilometers further down, right? You could see the scale here is 240 kilometers. So this particular deal, not too far from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, the effect could actually be felt all the way to the Kenya border, practically all the way to the Kenya border. So these spillovers are huge. Overusing water at the local level because of large-scale land acquisitions could have huge spillovers hundreds of kilometers downstream. All right. So we are at the interim conclusion. We looked at the different kind of sectors. Land deal affect the environment. Land deal affect food production, more crop, but also more exports. Land deals affect water competition, both at the site and beyond the site. But now, this is not super helpful because all these sectors are, as of now, looked at individually, right? And so if you're a policymaker and you have all those results, you're more interested in the trade-off and what could you actually do to improve the situation on the ground. So you're interested more in questions like, are all deals equally bad across the board? How can I regulate land deals to limit their negative impacts on local communities and ecosystems? Because this phenomena is happening anyway, right? It's not like you could eradicate land deal from the world, right? So what a policymaker is potentially interested is to put land deals in buckets and to identify the ones that are the least, maleficial or the most beneficial or that hurt the least, so to say, right? And so we should be a bit more subtle in our analysis. And this is the next part of the paper where we looked at the different, transsectoral impacts. So to do this, we looked at these three different sectors, so food, water, and the environment. We had two different variables for each of them. And what we really had to do was to try to see if it was possible to group the different land deals into quote unquote buckets according to their effects on their combined effect on those six sectors. So to do this, we use machine learning. It's a very basic approach called clustering, where the idea is to map each land deal into a space that spans by those six variables. So for each land deal, we know the value of deforestation, biodiversity, crop cover, et cetera, et cetera. And so we could map each deal on in that parameter space. And then as a computer to group the deals according to the position in this parameter space. And this hopefully will allow us to identify archetypes that call for different policy approaches. So this is what we did. So these are the results. So we have the value of the normalized variables here. So for example, this is forest cover. 1 means it's completely forested. 0 means there's no forest. The little dots here are individual deals. And the big symbols are the different cluster centroids. So this is 0.75 here, for example, is the mean forest fraction of all the deals that are in this particular cluster. And I'll tell you more a little bit about what these clusters are in a minute. Same thing for species richness, which you remember goes between 0 and 1. So 100% of biodiversity in pristine condition versus 0. Crop fraction, this is the probability of the crop being eaten locally as opposed to exported. This is the blue water stress. So how much so it's a ratio between how much water you need to irrigate and how much water you have to irrigate. And this is the green water stress, which is the ratio between how much rainfall there is and how much water the crop actually needs. So once we identify all those clusters, the key thing is to label them, to interpret them. What does it mean to be in this cluster? So for this, what I did is that I tried to look at each individual cluster and identify where they are in the parameter space and try to put a label. For example, this one is clearly forest. You have 75% forest cover and very high biodiversity. So this one is clearly forest. Then you have commercial agriculture, and this comes up as a very large crop fraction compared to all the other clusters, and also a very low probability of being eaten locally. And then you have 2 distinct clusters depending on whether you have water competition, so very strong water needs and a low water availability or not. Then you have local agriculture, almost the same profile, big differences here, where you have most of the crops being eaten locally. And finally, cash crops and plantations. These have low crop fractions. So it's mostly, palm oil or rubber, and also very low propensity of being consumed locally. It's mostly non-food that's being exported. We did that for all the deals, the land that's being acquired before it's actually being acquired, so the pre-condition. And then we did the same thing after the deal. So we started over again, did the whole clustering and labeling again after the deal. And we find that surprisingly, we have a very similar profile. So we also have cash crops, we also have commercial irrigation, etc. The only the only category that's in the that's before the deal and not after the deal are pristine forests. So we don't have any pristine forests after the deals, so which kind of makes sense. Then what we did is that we mapped the trajectory of each deal between its pre-deal cluster and post-deal clusters. For example, all the A1 deals here move from intensive agriculture to intensive agriculture. So they didn't really change their cluster type. For example, here, let's say this one here. So C3 moves from local agriculture. So this is smallholder farmers in Africa, for example, towards cash crops. So this is cash crops, etc. And then we computed the difference in each variable for each trajectory to try to understand the different deals trajectory that happen. And so we have clearly 3 broad groups of trajectories that really pop out. The first one we call consolidation. So here the category of land deal didn't really change. So you move from high, intensive agriculture to intensive agriculture. And so obviously there's also no clear impacts on food, water, energy, etc. Right? Because, for example, like I told earlier, a place in Eastern Europe was already deforested. You had an investment to consolidate, the farms that were already there, and so you didn't have really any additional deforestation. This is what we're talking about here. The second really big cluster here is status quo. So this is land that was purchased but not really developed. We could think about speculative land deals, for example, or stuff like that. A lot of these land deals were actually never developed the way the investors intended to do. So there's a very significant portion here. Importantly here, you have a group of deals that used to be cash crops. So these are, for example, cocoa farms in Ghana that have been purchased, cut out, but then nothing really happened. And so you had traditional agriculture that moved in. And so this ends up being a decrease in the propensity of export and an increase in local food availability, as you could see here. Then the third big group is what I call here development, for lack of a better word, I mean, is where you have local agriculture or pristine forest that's been displaced and developed for either cash crop or intensive irrigated agriculture. And this is really where you see the big sectoral effects. Okay, so this is almost there. And I hope I'm not running out of time in 10 more minutes. The last, kind of to close the circle here, we had all these sectorial impacts, but what I'm really interested is in how these sectorial impacts actually trickle down and affect households, either in terms of livelihoods, in terms of health, etc. And so we're interested in answering questions like, what are the impact of blah, blah, blah archetype deals like A1, the deal that went from already developed to already developed, on some variable, some health or livelihood variable. We're particularly interested in seeing whether different archetypes of land deals have different impacts on the household levels, because that would be very important from a policy standpoint. And in order to do that, we leverage a DHS dataset. So that's the Demography and Health Survey dataset. It's a program that was implemented by USAID for the last, 30 years or so. It's a huge treasure mine of amazing data at the household level. We were able to collect about 1.3 million households in 121 waves across 22 countries where land deals were located. And so the idea here is to somehow use this data set to identify any change in household level variables that could be associated to land deals. So we use space essentially to attribute, to match households to land deals. So any households located within a certain radius of a land deal, so here, for example, 30 kilometer was associated with the land deal, so was treated by the land deal. And any household within a certain additional buffer of space from the land deal was considered as control. Now, D1 and D2 are somewhat variable because they're very arbitrary. So we did a huge sensitivity analysis that I won't go into detail, but the results that I'm going to show here account for uncertainty into the actual ranges that should be taken into account. And then the idea is to identify, first of all, for each surveyed household, whether they are in the control or the treatment group, and whether they were surveyed before or after the implementation of the closest deal. And this allows us to have a very neat data structure that allows us to get at causal inference. So we have a controlled experiment, so to say. And you could really see here, so this is again a regression discontinuity plot where you have years after the deals at 0, right? So if it's positive, it means the household had been interviewed after the deal. If it's negative, the household had been interviewed before the deal. And here you have in blue the control and in orange the treatment. And you could see that before the land deals, control and treatment, they very much follow a similar trajectory, which is very encouraging. That's what you want, right? But then after the land deal happens, you have all of a sudden a decrease in this variable for the treatment, so where the deal actually happens, and no decrease for the control. Now, what is this variable? I forgot to mention this, but this is the individual diet diversity score. So this is at the child level. The mom is being asked whether or not the child has consumed food from 10 given food groups within the last 24 hours. So these food groups are cereals, dairy, meat, etc. So these are 10 food groups that nutritionists say are very important. And if they have consumed all of them, so all 10 food groups, they have a score of 10. If they have consumed 0 of these food groups, they have a score of 0. And so WHO recommends, I think, a score of 5. My kids have approximately 7 on average. And so you could see, so this kind of tells us how diverse the diet is, and by consequence, how healthy it is, and how it gives a good indication on household health at the children level. And so this tells us basically that the deals have noticeable causal effect on dietary diversity of children in the sample that we have. And this is about 19,000 children over 60 deal. So namely, they decrease dietary diversity by 0.25 points. So remember, it's a 10-point score. So this was already known. We already published a paper on this in 2021. What we were more interested is whether this effect changes if you looked at the different types of archetypes of households of land use, I mean, separately. And so we found very interesting results. So first of all, in many cases, we didn't find any effects. And these are most of the land deals, or most of the archetypes, I should say, that have many land deals. So this tells us that there's many unobserved factors that affect dietary diversity, which is kind of expected. So if you take a very large sample of land deals, very likely you'll have some positive, some negative, and so on average, you won't observe anything. However, when we have a smaller sample of land deals, so in this case 2, so this is the archetype C3 that goes from local agriculture to cash crops. We only have 2 deals that had overlapping DHS survey households. And here we saw, for example, a negative effect. So here, and this is for different values of D1 and D2. Remember, I told you we did a sensitivity analysis. So whenever it's orange, it means there was a negative effect. And so we see here in this case, the effect is always negative. So when you have this archetype from local agriculture to commercial agriculture, generally you have, a decreased, a negative impact on dietary diversity. Sometimes you have positive impacts, and this is also important to point out. So for example, when you have A1, so this is consolidation of intensive agriculture, so mostly in Eastern Europe, where you have a very intensive agriculture region, and the investor comes in and buys land between the farms in order to make the farm bigger, so to say. Here you have a positive impact on dietary diversity. Or in this case, this is abandonment of a cocoa plantation in Ghana, these 3 deals specifically. You could also see a positive impact on households because they were able to come back and to use the land to produce, local staples. Interestingly, so we redid the analysis, but instead of looking at all 10 food groups, we only focused on animal products, so meats, fish, dairy, etc. And we could see that really the effect for these 2 particular archetypes is dominated by an increased consumption of meat. So this kind of suggests that it's really through an increased income that the effect actually happens. Now, a caveat, of course, is that we can only observe the households that are actually there. So it's possible that quite a few households have been displaced by the land deals and are not there anymore when the survey is being taken. And so these households are not included in the results, but they may have a decreased dietary diversity. Effect of water scarcity, quite important. So in places we have economic water scarcity, so remember, this is a situation where you need water, you have water, but you don't have the infrastructure to access it. There we see a positive effect of land deals. But when you have physical water scarcity, so when you don't have enough water to go around and you have this additional draw on the water resource, here we see definitely negative effects of the land deals on dietary diversity. And what's more concerning is that redoing the analysis focusing on specific food groups, so here we focus specifically on fruits and vegetables, so high nutrition food groups, we could see that this is really where the effect dominates. It's really for fruits and vegetables that we could see a decreased consumption for these particular type of land deals. So this is particularly concerning. All right, so coming full circle, we did this robust land deal archetyping based on sectorial impacts. We found that approximately 50% of all our 400 deals that we considered are under development, meaning that they move from traditional land systems to intensive agricultural land systems, implying that they have nexus impacts, so an impact on either water, food, energy, and the environment, or several combinations of them. The remaining 50%, and this is a big, it's a sizable portion of these land deals, they actually either remain in status quo, meaning they're not being developed, or they are consolidating. So it means it's already intensive agriculture that is being consolidated. And there's no or only mildly positive impacts on food, water, or the environment. And this is important to point out, right? Because when you think about large-scale land acquisition, oftentimes you do think about development, but many of the deals are actually not developed. We find an overall negative impact on children diets, as I said earlier. But importantly, this impact varies a lot across the types of land deals. And this is very important to keep in mind. So land deals are not a monolith. There's very much types of land deals that have different policy implications, different impacts, and and therefore in needs of different types of regulations. Whenever there is physical water scarcity, likelihood is that the deal will not be beneficial. So these deals should not happen in places where there is pre-existing water scarcity. If there is economic water scarcity, it could be positive, and the deal could actually introduce, much needed water infrastructure to actually make use of the water. However, these deals are very rare, as I showed earlier in my presentation. If we have farm consolidation or somehow the deals allow the land to transition out of a plantation system, then it could have a positive impact. I say it could because it's not given that they have a positive impact because as I discussed earlier, there's very, very many local covariates that play a very big role. And so there's a potential for land deals to have a positive impact if they happen under these conditions, and it's usually through increased income for local communities. But in order for that to happen, you need many, you need many policy conditions that are not necessarily there at all the places. So this is kind of fruit for future research. More generally, I find it important that if you were to try to connect household level impacts, in this case, dietary diversity of children, to the land deals, only focusing on one of the sectors, for example, only based on their effect on the water sector or only based on their effect on the food sector, you wouldn't find a good match, right? It's kind of hard to tell, only looking at food, or only looking at the environment, whether a land deal will have a strong negative effect on child dietary diversity. However, when you look at these sectors in combination, so if you take into account the full nexus perspective, then you see very strong connection, as I showed to you earlier. So it's really the interaction of sectors that ultimately govern the impact of land deals on households. All right. I hope it wasn't too fast or too slow. I have a bit of a flu, so I apologize in advance if my brain is slow today, but I hope it was understandable. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. That was really fabulous. Yeah, real whirlwind. I guess I'm wondering about some of the policy implications about the results that you were finding, especially the kind of potential positive. I mean, how might some of your studies inform ways of ensuring that you're enhancing and not undermining food and water security?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a bit nervous when when I get asked this type of question because on one hand, you don't want to oversimplify, right? You don't want to say, okay, this type of deal always leads to this situation. But at the other hand, if you want to do policy, you have to somehow, generalize slightly, right? Because a policy is not necessarily applied to a specific location, but is applied to a group of locations, right? So with this caveat, what I would say, for example, if you wanted, if you wanted kind of general direction, I would say that if you're in an arid area, land deals are a no-go. It should not happen in arid areas because in general, that has a huge impact on the local population, as we have seen here, but also on downstream population. So there's a very strong spatial spillover. We could also say that land deals are less bad if it is an area if they happen in an area that's already pretty intensively cultivated, like Eastern Europe, for example, or some places in Latin America where you already have large-scale farms, and so the comparative impacts of land deals is actually much lower there.
I'm also wondering, I really loved your slides. I like that you had the QR codes for your papers, and also I really liked the images that you created, with ChatGPT, and it sort of got me thinking about, given the large scale land acquisitions really reshape local food and water systems, and at the same time there's this impact of of AI infrastructure. Have you done any research in this area?
No, but that's an excellent point. So you're saying the potential impacts on of data center on this. Yeah, I mean that's an excellent point. I know that there is more and more research being done on the water and energy footprints of data centers, mostly focused in the US. But I'm not aware of any research being done at the global level. But that's an excellent point.
I also want to open it up to other future research directions that you're looking at and see if we could talk about, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that we're looking at right now, as I showed in one of my earlier slide, is that one of the phenomenon that's kind of fueling the land acquisition process right now is, the rush for critical minerals, right? So there is an increasing need for critical minerals to fuel the clean energy transition. And so similar, not identical, obviously, but a similar type of dynamic is taking place where you have an increasing movement to acquire either the land or concessions on the land to mine for these minerals. And so we're interested in looking at how this framework or these impacts might be applicable to this different context. What could be transferred in terms of what we learned about land deals in an agricultural context to land deals in a mining context, and what is different, what is not as bad, or what is much worse. So this is kind of what we're thinking about at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It was very excellent presentation and a lot of thought-provoking. I have one clarification. I didn't get how economic like you said that economic development has positive impact on through fruits and veggies.
Yeah, I think okay. So maybe referring to economic water scarcity. So what in some of the
I didn't get that fully. So can you explain?
Yeah, so there's this concept called economic water scarcity that was published in Science Advances in 2020, I believe, where so usually when you think about water scarcity, you think about physical water scarcity. So either there's not enough rain, in which case it's green water scarcity, or there's not enough groundwater or surface water to irrigate, in which case it's blue water scarcity. But in some situations, you actually have enough water to irrigate, but you don't have the infrastructure to access the water to irrigate. And so this is referred to as economic water scarcity. And so what we find is that whenever this situation arises on land deals, then maybe having investors actually come in and invest into irrigation infrastructure could actually be beneficial. And we found that, now this is a very small sample, I should preface this, but in the few deals that we found, whenever this phenomenon happens, whenever you're in the condition of economic water scarcity, we saw an increase in dietary diversity of children after the land deals, mainly due to increased consumptions of food and vegetables. But again, this is only for 2 deals on a sample of 400, where you had economic water scarcity present and you had household surveys. So these are the 2 conditions that are very, very restrictive.
And most of all the deals that you have analyzed are mainly deals that are for agricultural practice only?
Yes.
So
I forgot to mention this.
There are many land deals in Africa now happening for like biofuel development or forestation under the global carbon credit program. So did you also look into those things, how that's affect?
So our inclusion criteria was that the deal should be large. So this is more than 200 hectares. And should involve some agriculture. So obviously food production is important. Tree plantation was also accounted for. So if you had, for example, like palm oil and stuff like that, and also by extension, some biofuel production practices like jatropha, palm oil, stuff like that. So it includes biofuel, but not all biofuel. It includes forest, but not all forest. Like if it's a purely conservation-oriented land deal, it wasn't accounted for. If it's purely for carbon credits, it wasn't accounted for. So it has to involve some type of cropping activity or some type of plantation activity.
Thank you.
Okay, and maybe as a follow-on to Martin's question, I'm just wondering, was there any way you ground truth any of the land deals? Because I'm aware that most of the potentially designated land for agriculture in Africa, or at least in Nigeria, that I'm very familiar with, are being grabbed towards real estate, and massive amounts of land in this regard. So I'm just wondering that there any form of branch routing that you did to really ascertain that these land deals that you're talking about are yes meant for agriculture and are actually being used for agriculture. Yeah.
No, that's an excellent point. And as a matter of fact, to answer your question, we did some point checking and stuff like that. We did not go on the ground to check, but you make an excellent point. Most of these land deals are not being developed, and that's one of the outcomes of a substantial portion of these land deals are not actually being developed, and that's one of the takeaways of the research, is that, as I said, on our sample, only approximately 50% of the land deals moved from traditional land systems towards intensive agricultural land systems. The other half is either already developed, so it's large farms that are being acquired around other large farms, or it's places that were purchased but nothing really happened. So these are definitely in our sample, and we definitely account for that.
And you have a question from online. Kyle is asking, first says, excellent talk, and says, can you provide any insights on how employment or income of local communities may be benefited or impacted by these deals? Is there a trade-off between diet diversity and livelihood opportunities, perhaps in certain cases?
Oh, that's a tough question. Thanks, Kyle. I mean, I know there's research so we didn't look at income or livelihood simply because we didn't have the data for this. So the DHS data does not have income data. It has assets data, asset ownership data, so if you own a car and stuff like that. But we found, or previous research has found, that these are really sticky. If your situation improves, you're not going to immediately buy a car or TV, right? And so it's very hard to see the effect of land deals on our asset ownership. So long story short, I don't know firsthand, but I know there's research on this, and I know that it really depends on the local situation. And I also know that Cal probably knows better than me the answer. So I don't know, to be honest, I don't know.
Question, excellent talk, of course. The question for you is, how, with the current changes in the world, the term food security is becoming a little vague, and then what was your definition of food security? And do you think we should reshape, redevelop the concept?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, so traditionally, the concept of food security is based on the 4 pillars, right? So adequacy, that you have sufficiently nutritious foods, that it's sustainable, and that you could actually have access to it. We in our research here, we only measure food security in terms of dietary diversity. That's a very incomplete measure. Of course, it's the only one that was available in the data. But we believe it's already slightly more specific than simply looking at the number of calories eaten or even the amount of crops being grown. Because one of the key things that we showed is that when you have large-scale land acquisitions, you do have more food being produced, but this food is not being eaten by the local population, right? And so this distinction is super important. And so that's why I think your question is a very important one. We should really be careful of accounting for all the different dimensions of food security. And so by looking at dietary diversity, we look at some of it. But for example, we don't look at sustainability. We don't see, because the survey only asks the mom, whether this food has been consumed in the last 24 hours. But this does not account for seasonality, for example, whether yesterday was special, or whether, do you see what I mean? Like whether this dietary diversity could be sustained in the long run. And that's one of the key pillars of food security. So we should definitely expand the research to also account for more of these dimensions that are very important.
And another thing which again might not be related to your research right now, but can be something to work on in the future. Do you think we can optimize essentially food security according to the resources available in each country or region? So right now, we have nations that eat too much rice, for example. They love rice, and rice is not optimal. or like, which, and then there's not necessarily a nutrition justification for that. It's just a cultural thing. Do you think that could be a possibility?
Yeah, I know there's research going on this angle. So the idea would be to optimize the distribution of crop types globally based on different criteria, right? So I am aware that they used the climate, soil suitability, water availability, etc. And I think they also use calorie production and stuff like that. Now, this is, I think, a good direction to go, and you could add additional optimization criteria, right, including the specific dimensions of food security that we just discussed. And I think this is good as a blueprint or as a template, like basically the type of crops or the type of situation that we should aim if the Earth was optimally governed by, some benevolent tyrants, right? But in reality, I think it's going to be very difficult to implement because, first of all, farming is very capital intensive and it has a lot of inertia. So in order to change farming practices, you need to have a very big impetus. And also food in general has a very deep cultural meaning locally. And so that's one of the reasons why actually moving away from local crop staple hurts diversity so badly, right? Because it's so difficult for people to switch what they eat, right? And so somehow this optimization exercise that we discussed should account for this. But yeah, this would require much more data on, nutrition habits and stuff like that I am not familiar with.
Sorry, Kaveh. Another scenario to what Kaveh is saying is also the fact that, in terms of food security, is also the fact that some crops are being grown in some areas are not really being eaten by the local population. They're just, there for export. We have a lot of examples like that in Southern Africa, where, the multinationals come, invest, buy a lot of land, and grow peas, for instance, green peas that are not even, the farmers themselves, that are busy, growing and, working on those farms, don't even get to see the final product because as soon as they just shipped out. So that's another, dimension, to food security that is worth looking into. But I understand it's complex.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's one of the dimensions we try to capture with analysis. So if you remember, one of the 6 variables was the probability that whatever is being planted in the acquired land was going to be consumed locally. So this includes the criteria that what's being grown is food to begin with, and then food that's not being exported. And we see that land deals generally imply a decrease of this probability, meaning that it's in general, it's hard to generalize again, but in general, you have a transition from local staples to export-bound cash crops. You're absolutely right.
You mentioned also that there was a more nuanced effect on farm consolidation or transition out of plantations. What do you think was the reason for that?
I mean, my guess is that when you have a consolidation of intensive agricultural farmlands, the local communities already, they're not subsistence farmers, right? If they earn income in agriculture, they probably already work for a commercial agriculture firm, and so in these conditions, then what could happen is that additional investment into this context could actually create more income for the local communities. But again, the big caveat here is that we haven't accounted in our analysis for the effect that this practice might have on displacing people, right? Because if they're displaced, they can't be interviewed. So we don't know if most of these people are actually being displaced, and so we can't account for them. And the people that actually happen to stay, well, they do better, obviously, because they could work, right? So we don't really have a full picture of what's happening.
So I have a question about one of your previous slides where you were talking about looking at the child level individual nutrition. I noticed that there was a drop between year 4 to year 2 before the land deal. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on what might have caused that in both the control and the treatment case.
Yeah, this is very difficult to enter. Let me share my slides again, if I can. Oop. You talking about this one?
Yes.
Well, you have a jar right here. Yeah, it's very difficult to interpret because the data is very heterogeneous in the sense that you have many different survey waves that happen in many different countries and that are not timed very well with regards to the land deals, right? So it's possible that many of the, that's all these all these data here that represents 4 here are focused on a particular, I mean, all these surveyed households that represent year 3 focused on a particular set of land deals that are subject to the same shock, right? It's very difficult to interpret movements before and after the treatment. But what's very important is that whatever happens, it happens both for the control and the treatment, meaning that whatever effect we estimate will not be accounted. I mean, will not account for these artifacts, if that makes sense, right? If we compare treatment and control, and we both know, I mean, we know that both groups are bumpy and, are subject to some shocks that we can't really observe. What we really are after is a difference between the two, and the difference between the two is pretty significant. I hope it was not too, I rambled a little bit here.
No, not at all. It's great.
Any other questions?
Yeah, please, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And we can also send the questions to you after the talk as well.
Sounds great. Absolutely. Yeah, feel free to be in touch. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We remind you again that all of our previous talks are available online, and this talk will be available online shortly as well. Thank you so much, Professor Muller. This was really fabulous. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.